Hi, it's Christina with the Sisyphean Journal. This is day 2 of our walk through the Philly Inquirer's excellent expose, The Dreaded Complication, about live births from safe and legal abortions. So, part 1 was yesterday, part 2 is today, and then we're going to get into the live birth section of line 5 on the next day. So, this section started with looking at the impact of later abortions on staff. Now, one of the ways that they worked to prevent these live births that could get your butt sued off by the mother or get you prosecuted for murder if some nurse opened up her mouth and said, he strangled that baby right in front of me. Doctors started doing what the abortion lobby calls D&E, dilation and evacuation abortions. And that's technically the term, but the term they use when they are describing it to each other among doctors, they talk about this is graphic, dismemberment of the unborn baby. If the baby is in pieces, it's definitely dead. That's the whole goal here. But there's kind of a downside to using that method to make sure that you get a dead baby. I'm not going to go into that graphic detail, but if you follow the link below, I have some of what doctors have said about using D&E abortions to avoid the live birth problem. And I even include a link to Warren Hearn's paper, What About Us? Staff Reactions to D&E. So now we can go back to trying to get the numbers. So they did a study looking at 150,000 abortions performed in upstate New York from July of 1970, when abortion on demand was legalized on an outpatient basis through 24 weeks, through the end of December of 1972. And they found a reported 38 live births. That's fewer than one live birth for every 4,000 abortions. However, you know, when you're in a country where they're doing 4,000 abortions a day, you're getting about one live birth a day probably. That's in keeping with what Willard Cates of the CDC was anticipating. And in the mid-1970s, a hospital in Hartford, Connecticut found signs of life in 10% of their prostaglandin babies. The authors note, evidence gathered during research for this story suggests, without proving definitively, that much of the traffic in late abortions now flows to New York and Los Angeles metropolitan areas where loose practice more easily escapes notice. They quoted the Daily Breeze, which indicated, word has spread that facilities in greater Los Angeles will do late abortions. How late, only the woman and the doctor who performs them know. And this, of course, makes it impossible to even estimate how many post-viability abortions those doctors were doing, much less how many babies survived. And I'm going to add, if you look at information from the Alan Guttmacher Institute and the Centers for Disease Control, they are very careful not to keep tabs on how many post-viability abortions there are. They'll usually say, 18 weeks and later. They're not going to say 22 weeks and later, 24 weeks and later, 26 weeks and later. They're very, very careful to not even try to collect that data. I find that interesting. So the authors of that one study seemed a bit queasy about post-viability abortions. An internal investigation at Jewish Memorial Hospital in Manhattan showed that 6 fetuses aborted there in the summer of 1979 weighed more than 1 1/3 pounds. The babies were not alive, but were large enough to be potentially viable. A state health inspector found in 1979 that the unit had successfully aborted a fetus that was well over a foot long and appeared to be of 33 weeks gestation. Hospital officials confirmed in an interview that later in 1979, a fetus weighing more than 4 pounds had been aborted. So then they look a little bit at attitudes toward this. Iona Siegel, administrator of the Women's Health Center at Kingsbrook Jewish Medical Center in Brooklyn, told reporters that she found it disconcerting when post-viability abortions were performed. And she said that she often heard patients turned away by Kingsbrook because they were past 24 weeks of pregnancy and managed to arrange abortion elsewhere. She said, "That makes me angry. Number one, it's against the law. Number two, it's dangerous to the health of the mother." And the Inquirer didn't notice if she found it disturbing that viable unborn babies were being painfully put to death. The authors quoted Dr. Irvin Nichols, who was director of practice activities for the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology. He said, "We're not really very pro-abortion. As a matter of fact, anything beyond 20 weeks, we're kind of upset about that." The article continued, "If abortions after 20 weeks are a dubious practice, how does that square with abortions up to 24 weeks being offered openly in Los Angeles and New York and advertised in newspapers and the Yellow Pages and elsewhere?" "That's not medicine," Nichols replied. "That's hucksterism." By the way, the ACOG has since changed its tune. They now blithely endorse abortions comprehensively and in fact advocate, and this is quoting, "to integrate abortion as a component of mainstream medical care and to oppose and overturn efforts to restrict access to abortion." And access, as we've seen, includes the right to a dead baby if it has the temerity to emerge alive. Then they looked at another case, an undetermined date in Southern California. They share the story of a nurse named Linda. As she was hurrying out of a patient's room one day to dispose of the aborted tissue, as nurses are taught to think of it, she felt movement. Startled, she looked down, straight into the staring eyes of a live baby. "It looked right at me," she recalled. "This baby had real big eyes. It looked at me like it was saying, 'Do something, do something.' Those haunting eyes, oh God, I still remember them." Linda rushed the baby to the nursing station. The child's heartbeat was 80 to 100 per minute, and it was taking 3 to 4 breaths per minute. It weighed 1.5 pounds. Linda called the doctor because she said the baby was pink. It had a heartbeat. The doctor told me the baby was not viable and to send it to the lab. I said, "But it's breathing." And he said, "It's non-viable. It won't be breathing long. Just send it to the lab." So, unwilling to just send a live baby to the pathology lab, Linda looked to her nursing supervisor for help. She said to follow the doctor's orders and send it to the lab. Linda put the baby in a makeshift crib with a hot water bottle for warmth and a tube blowing oxygen past the child's head. The baby died 2.5 hours later. Linda said, "I stood by and watched that baby die without doing a thing. I have guilt feelings to this day. I feel the baby might have lived if it had been properly cared for." And then they look at a couple of babies in Ohio. Jane was a head floor nurse in an Ohio hospital when she spoke to Inquirer reporters. In 1978, the nurses there successfully petitioned the hospital to stop doing late abortions. She spoke of a 16-year-old patient in 1975 who phoned her mother and cried out, "Ma, it's out, but Ma, it's alive." In 1974, Jane said she was summoned by a patient's roommate. "When I got there, the baby's head was sticking out and its little tongue was wiggling. Everybody felt like they couldn't do anything until they called the doctor. And it was a little thing. It only lasted about 15 minutes, but it was alive and we did nothing, and that was wrong." That even the babies that were successfully killed in utero disturbed Jane. "Because of my position, I had to pick them up off the bed and put them in a bottle of formalin. Sometimes you have to get a very large container. Our gynecologists seem to have a very poor ability to determine gestational age. Time and time again, they would say with a straight face, 'This woman is 20 weeks pregnant,' when she was actually 26 weeks. And then we have a baby girl in California, May 3rd of 1980. An obstetrical nurse named Norma described an event that took place the night of May 3rd, 1980. A 15-year-old girl had been in a traffic accident that had killed 4 people. Fearful that the baby might have been injured, the girl went into the hospital 2 weeks later for an abortion. The baby had a normal heartbeat of 132 to 136 before the abortion was initiated, and the girl delivered the baby alive. The nurse said that the patient cried hysterically, "Get rid of it! I'm sorry, Mama, get rid of it!" The nurse said of the baby, "She was beautiful. She was pink. There were no physical deformities. She let out a little lusty cry. She lay in a basin put there to catch all the stuff. She was waving her arms and legs. You could tell she was making a big effort to live." The baby weighed 1 pound 14 ounces. Without consulting any doctors, the nurses arranged to transfer the baby to Loma Linda University Medical Center, which was equipped to deal with very premature infants. The doctor there said the little girl didn't seem to have been harmed by the saline used to abort her, and at first she seemed to be doing okay, but she died at 11 days of age. The family members were angry that the nurses had tried to save the baby. Now, the article looks at the legal status. The court granted women an unrestricted right to abortion in the first trimester of pregnancy. From that point to viability, the state can regulate abortions only to make sure they are safe, and only after a fetus reaches viability can the state laws limit abortion and protect the rights of the fetus. They note that in writing the majority opinion in Roe, Blackmun took no particular account, though, of the possibility of abortion live births or of errors in estimating gestational age. They reviewed subsequent court cases regarding abortions at and past viability. A Missouri law was too specific in forbidding abortions after 24 weeks. It is not the proper function of the legislature or the court, Blackmun wrote, to place viability, which is essentially a medical concept, at a specified point in the gestational period. But letting the decision be a medical one didn't pass Blackmun muster either, because by banning abortions, if there is sufficient reason to believe that the fetus may be viable, was too vague and putting the doctors in too tenuous a position. State laws could not interfere with the doctor's professional judgment by dictating the choice of procedure for late abortions or by requiring aggressive care of abortion live births. And the article noted that as of 1979, according to the Alan Guttmacher Institute, 30 states had some sort of law trying to limit abortions at or post-viability, and some states had laws requiring that doctors try to save abortion survivors, but few states had laws both trying to limit late abortions and mandating that babies that survived those abortions got care. And the authors also noted that many of those laws would not stand if somebody decided to challenge them. And of course, in today's atmosphere, we've noticed that they are adamant. The abortion lobby is adamant. Abortion needs to be legal. The woman can be in labor, crowning, and say, I've changed my mind, I want an abortion, and should be allowed to insist on it. And the doctors have no obligation to the baby when it survives. It's up to the mother whether the baby lives or dies. That's the situation we're in right now. Then there's prosecutorial barriers. Bronx County Assistant District Attorney Alan Morris noted that he'd investigated several live birth cases but hadn't been able to prosecute any. He said you'd need an expert opinion that in fact there was life and the fetus would have survived. Often the fetus has been destroyed, so there's nothing for your expert to examine. And many cases would only come to light if a whistleblower came forward. The credibility of that sort of witness may be subject to attack, the authors noted, and even if the facts do weigh against a doctor, he has some resources left. Almost always he can claim to have made no more than a good faith error in medical judgment. And the Inquirer quoted a California prosecutor. This is happening all over the place. Babies that should live are dying because callous physicians let them die. He doubted that he'd ever be able to win a conviction because nobody's as dumb as Waddle. They're smarter today. They know how to cover themselves. I might point out that Waddle did get away with it. And then there's kind of this creepy thought. So the author spent some time looking at how improved neonatal care is pushing viability earlier and earlier in the pregnancy. And the authors quoted Roger K. Freeman, then medical director of Women's Hospital at Long Beach Memorial Medical Center. Medical advances in the treatment of premature babies enable us to save younger fetuses than ever before. When a fetus survives an abortion, however, there may be a collision of tragic proportions between medicine and maternity. Medicine is now able to give the premature a chance that may be rejected by the mother. And Freeman had developed the fetal stress test and helped develop a treatment to help premature lungs develop quickly and improve survival. So I'm guessing that the tragedy he's seeing is in collision between medicine and maternity, is that some women are tragically choosing to reject care for their abortion-surviving infants. But the idea that he labels this rejection maternity just creeps me out. And there's an unwillingness to head off the problem. The authors noticed that that there are two possible solutions to the problem of live babies surviving abortions. The simplest, advocated by Dr. Cicella Bach of the Harvard Medical School, among others, is just to prohibit late abortions. Taking into account the possible errors in estimating gestational age, she argues, the cutoff should be set well before the earliest gestational age at which infants are surviving. But the authors note, while other countries have taken this approach, The Supreme Court has applied a different logic in defining the abortion right, and the groups that won that right would not cheerfully accept retreat now. A second approach, the authors continue, advocated by Ms. Bach and others, is to define the woman's abortion right as only the right to terminate the pregnancy, not to have the fetus dead. Then, if the fetus is born alive, it is viewed as a person in its own right, entitled to care appropriate to its condition. They did note, however, that this is not likely a solution abortion practitioners are likely to accept. They quote Dr. Karenier of Mount Sinai again. You have to have a feticidal dose of the saline. It's almost a breach of contract not to. Otherwise, what are you going to do? Hand her back a baby having done it questionable damage? I say if you can't do it, don't do it. In other words, if you can't guarantee an in utero death, send her to somebody who can. The last baby they covered in this expose was born in Cleveland in March of 1978. The infant was transferred to Rainbow Baby and Children's Hospital, and after several weeks in intensive care, the baby was sent home with the mother. Mother and child returned to Rainbow for checkup when the child was 14 months old, the spokeswoman there said, and both were doing fine. The mother could not be reached for comment, but a source familiar with the case remembered one detail. The doctors had a very hard time making her realize she had a child. She kept saying, "But I had an abortion." So, tell me below, what do you think? Are those mean, nasty, horrible MAGA Republicans really, really mean and saying that if a 32-week baby survives an abortion, you should take it to the NICU rather than put it in a paper bag and leave it in the snow outside? I mean, it seems to me pretty obvious, live baby good, dead baby bad, but then I'm not an abortion rights advocate, am I?